We're not going to get a signed affidavit
Yeah.
from like the CIA or, you know, any intelligence agency talking about Epstein, including Israel's. So what are we left with? Well, we have to look at what is ultimately, you know, I guess circumstantial evidence, but you stack enough of it over the decades, you know, you can show that something shady is definitely going on.
Whitney Webb recently exposed Jeffrey Epstein's undeniable connections to intelligence services in the past in matters beyond child sex trafficking, actually money laundering and arms trafficking, and she answers the question as to why this is never brought up in relation to Epstein in mainstream conversations. She's the author of One Nation Under Blackmail, in my estimation, the best book on Epstein, so let's get her take on this. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
And Epstein during that time, you know, before then, between 1981 and 1985, described himself as a financial bounty hunter. He was hired to find money that had been stolen, and he hid away stolen money for powerful people. He played both sides. And someone who can effectively do that, he was hired by like very fancy, like aristocratic people for those purposes, admittedly. Like a very aristocratic Spanish family being one of them. They would not just hire some financially illiterate idiot to do that kind of stuff for them. And Adnan Khashoggi was one of his clients too. He's not going to hire a financially illiterate guy to do that. I think that is, it's bull, and it's part of this narrative that's been woven about Epstein, about how he was just charismatic and him being good at anything else was just a facade.
So it's a distraction.
Well, yeah, because by that narrative inherently means don't look any deeper into what Epstein was doing, you know, in his early history, for example.
Yeah, I generally agree. If you look at Epstein's past, the money laundering aspect and arms trafficking aspect is just as prevalent in his life and influences as the child sex trafficking and the blackmail operation, potentially. So she's exactly right about that. Adnan Khashoggi was kind of a playboy from Saudi Arabia. The prototypical playboy, had expensive yachts and a harem, and he was involved in the Israeli side of Iran-Contra, moving weapons between the United States and Israel to fund the Contras. And, you know, that's undeniable. And it is true that Epstein advertised himself as a guy that was a bounty hunter. He had learned money laundering schemes at Bear Stearns. We know that to be true. So I agree with her. This narrative that he was a bumbling idiot when it came to those things, I think is actually wrong.
Well, let's talk about that.
Sure.
Is this the arms trafficking?
Yeah, among other things. So,
okay, can we go back further, just for people who don't understand? How did he become a thing? Because wasn't he?
No one really knows, but it all
Yeah.
seems to have started with this backpacking trip to Europe in 1971, and this was when he was a college dropout. I think he went to Cooper Union, I think, for a few years, didn't finish. And then was started at NYU in 1971 through 74, but didn't get a degree, something like that. Somewhere in 1971, he went backpacking to Europe, and he was in the UK. And so in the UK, he became close friends with this famous cellist, Jacqueline Dupree. And reportedly, he claimed through her got sort of an in with the royal family at that point. I don't really know if that's true, but he comes back from that backpacking trip and he's hanging out at Jimmy Goldsmith's house. And Jimmy Goldsmith is an interesting figure. If you are a fan of Adam Curtis documentaries, you may remember him from the Mayfair set. He is a currency speculator, or was. He was very close to Robert Maxwell, among other figures. He was a member of this very interesting nexus in Mayfair called the Claremont Club, which was sort of this elite gambling club that a lot of interesting figures were tied to, including figures with intelligence links, organized crime links, and sex blackmail links. So, for example, if you're familiar with the Profumo affair in UK politics, the nexus responsible for that, which brought down the government of Harold Macmillan, has its nexus at the Claremont Club.
Yeah, this was called playing the box, and this is a skill that, Epstein learned from someone, whether it was from the Claremont Club or from Adnan Khashoggi, this idea that if you commit crimes and violate the law, but you do it in a manner that embarrasses others, such as that charges won't be brought against you, and it's particularly embarrassing to other people, when it's in accordance with what you did, that's how you can get away with crimes. And that's what Epstein employed throughout his career, whether it was on the arms trafficking and the money laundering side or, all other sides.
And Jimmy Goldsmith was a member of that, along with people that were also very close to Robert Maxwell, like Roland, or Tiny Roland, as he's remembered. And another well-known member is David Sterling, who basically started a lot of this movement, the private mercenary phenomena in Britain, among other things. So definitely a network of powerful people, and a lot of Epstein's early high society New York contacts. His earliest ones, a lot of them met him at Jimmy Goldsmith's mansion in New York.
Note that he had only made, maybe a few $100,000 at Bear Stearns when he worked his way up from the trade desk to become a partner of the firm, I think in something like 4 years. And he was a specialist at moving money. It seems like there was some, schemes to offset taxes for certain clients of Bear Stearns, and that's what he specialized in, and that's the skill he learned. But beyond that, it's not exactly clear how he made so much of his money. We know he got a lot of it from Robert Black, or Leon Black later in his life, and also from Les Wexner beginning in the 1980s. Wexner even gave him a $77 million property, the most valuable property in Manhattan. But it's not really clear how he made a lot of his money in the early 80s, but he was associated with these figures in arms trafficking like Douglas Leese and Adnan Khashoggi.
How were they connected?
So originally he's networking.
Yeah, but he's a college dropout. Something happens when he goes to Britain. We don't really know, but he gets connected with this crowd.
Do you have a suspicion?
It may have been through his daughter, Isabel Goldsmith. She's in the Black Book. It's hard to know. Also, Jacqueline Dupree was reportedly cultivated ties with sort of the New York Jewish community. Because she converted to Judaism in 1967. She was married, I think, to an Israeli musician, but she was close also to Itzhak Perlman, who's a famous New York musician. I think he's a violinist. I can't remember exactly what instruments he plays. Sorry. But he and Epstein had a pretty significant relationship also. But it's important to point out, when I say Epstein had a relationship with people, I'm not saying they had a sex blackmail relationship necessarily. Yeah. What we're trying to untangle here is the truth of who Epstein was and why was he taken down. Because I don't think he was taken down because in 2019, all of a sudden, the U.S. government became outraged about the sweetheart deal of 2007.
Yeah, I have to agree with that. We're only given breadcrumbs and trails that we can make connections based on the evidence that exists, because there is a cover-up at the highest levels of government to cover up this sex trafficking ring that involves some of the most powerful people in the world, that was likely part of a Mossad blackmail operation for Israel. Because of his connections to Israel, which are prevalent. She talked about Robert Maxwell. We know he had a connection to Ari Ben-Menash, who was a Mossad asset himself, actually a Mossad agent himself, and said that Epstein told him he was engaging in blackmail. We know that he was good friends with Ehud Barak, the former prime minister of Israel, who himself was also the head of IDF intelligence, stayed at his house for prolonged periods. We know these connections exist, and I'm with her. This just wasn't about, coincidental rage toward Epstein in 2019 over what had happened with his crimes before. He had gotten away with everything up to then. And according to his lawyers, he was in high spirits at the time that, he supposedly killed himself.
12 years after the fact, and then wanted to rectify some wrong. I think it was about something else. He pissed off somebody, or, something similar that befell Robert Maxwell, for example. But anyway.
Stop becoming useful, too much heat.
Something. I have some theories. We can get to those later. But going back to early Epstein, so he's in this network with Jimmy Goldsmith, and he gets hired in 1974, which is the year he stops going to university for any reason, and gets hired at the Dalton School, which is this elite New York private school. And he's hired by Donald Barr, who's William Barr's father. Donald Barr had worked at the OSS, and which is the precursor to the CIA. And then after that had been involved in all of these programs to identify gifted children when they were, high schoolers and things like that. And Epstein would have fallen in that category. We don't know if there was a connection there, but Epstein graduated high school like 2 years early. He was a math whiz and also got a scholarship to go to Interlochen, where he would later return to offend, actually, which is this kind of elite music school for really talented kids.
Yeah, Donald Barr was actually the father of William Barr, whose custody Epstein was in when he killed himself, actually, in 2019. And the crazy thing about Donald Barr, beyond his OSS connections, is the fact that he wrote a book. I think it was a few years after he hired Epstein to teach at the Dalton School with no credentials to do this. He wrote that space relations book about a planet ruled by oligarchs engaging in sex slavery. So this is the kind of book that Donald Barr wrote, eerily foreshadowing the future history of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. It's really pretty uncanny if you look into this.
And I think he went there because he was good at the bassoon or something, but he was apparently really good at math and could play a lot of different instruments and was, reportedly very talented. And he obviously caught people's attention for some reason.
Was it Bear Stearns from there?
It was Bear Stearns from there. So it depends on who you believe about who hired him, but it was Ace Greenberg at the end of the day, who became CEO or the head of Bear Stearns, I think, in 1978. But there's a lot of people, there's a lot of baton passing here for responsibility. And I think that's kind of common now that Epstein is kind of an infamous character.
Yeah, one of the stories has it that he was a math tutor after he had taught at the Dalton School, and through that's how he met Ace Greenberg. But it still doesn't really make sense how this, operator of Bear Stearns hedge fund is going to hire Jeffrey Epstein for no reason, a guy that was kicked out as a failed math teacher because he was fraternizing with young female students of his, eerily so, that freaked some of them out. And he's on the fast track from the trade desk, which he didn't succeed at, to the money laundering side of Bear Stearns, and then becomes a partner in something like 4 years. Another unexplainable aspect of his life.
Right.
Yeah.
So the sister, allegedly it was the daughter of Ace Greenberg. She denies it. She says it was some kid at school, one of her friends another kid at school, their dad was friendly with Greenberg and recommended Epstein to Greenberg. I don't know. There's all these different
the tutor math, supposedly, right?
Stories, but there's an agreement that it was Greenberg that brought him to Bear Stearns.
Okay.
It's a little complicated, sorry, but basically, Epstein joins Bear Stearns in 1976. And by 1980, he's like a limited partner. He has a very meteoric rise at the firm. Oh, yeah. He was basically Greenberg's protege. And then he leaves in 1981. There's a lot of different stories there. But it seems like the most likely explanation is that there was this SEC investigation because the trade at the center of that investigation happens the day before Epstein resigns Bear Stearns. And the official story that he had been fined for not reporting something in the expense account appropriately doesn't really make sense with why he would leave a job as a limited partner, netting him a lot of money for a fine that was relatively small.
Yeah, there's other stories that he was improperly buying securities for his friends or something like that, and it wasn't actually related to the SEC, investigation. But either way, if you believe the SEC investigation explanation for why he left Bear Stearns, it was over, serving the client Edward Bronfman, who headed the Seagram's company.
And then you have other Bear Stearns executives and Epstein himself say, "Oh, I wanted to strike out on my own and make my own business." At that point, there again a lot of conflicting information. But the SEC case revolves around the Bronfman family, insider trading involving Seagrams, and a lot of other people that are sort of in this network. One of the guys involved in that insider trading scandal later becomes a big part of Jimmy Goldsmith's corporate rating in the U.S. and his acquisition of this company called Crown Zellerback. And which is part of this. Well, I don't want to throw out too many names that confuses people. But the Drexel Burnham Lambert, they're like the heart of a lot of the savings and loans and junk bond scandal, financial funny business going on in the 80s. And Epstein has a lot of ties to that crowd. And so Epstein appears to have been advised to leave Bear Stearns because of that investigation. I argue in the book it was probably to take heat off of Ace Greenberg, who had become CEO at that point. Epstein was his protege, and having him sort of go and take the fall for it made it a lot easier.
That's a plausible explanation, but what we also know, too, after he left Bear Stearns is it was within months of that he somehow, on a private jet with Douglas Leese, this figure involved in arms trafficking operations in the 1980s, flying on a private jet to the Pentagon. For reasons we still don't know, but this is a known factor, that after he left Bear Stearns, he was suddenly involved with a famous arms trafficker on the plane to the Pentagon, and without explanation. This rise, it doesn't make sense unless there was some kind of intelligence connection with Epstein.
For them. But what's interesting about this, too, is that the lawyer for Bear Stearns up until a few weeks prior had been Bill Casey, who had just been tapped as Reagan's CIA director. So whoever Bill Casey left his whole legal portfolio to of all his long-time legal clients would have been the person to make that call. And then after he leaves, he, becomes involved in this financial bounty hunting where he's hiding and finding money for powerful people in, offshore shadow bank world. In 1981 is also where Casey brings in Khashoggi for Iran-Contra related purposes and all of that. And Khashoggi becomes Epstein's client. All sorts of things start to kick off.
Yeah, Epstein created his own company and said he was a financial bounty hunter. And he said his limitation was to be his client, you had to have $1 billion to invest through him. Not just be a billionaire, have $1 billion to invest through him. And there's not much evidence he actually invested on the part of these clients, whether it be Khashoggi or Les Wexner or others. That might have been a cover story for what he was actually doing, but we know he was interested in and skilled in money laundering.
Same names keep coming up over and over again. And sometimes not even just say it's the family.
Well, like I was saying earlier, we're not going to get a signed affidavit from like the CIA or, any intelligence agency talking about Epstein. Including Israel's. So what are we left with? Well, we have to look at what is ultimately, I guess, circumstantial evidence, but you stack enough of it over the decades, you can show that something shady is definitely going on. And that's the reason my books are long and so detail-oriented, is because that's all we really have in terms of open source intelligence to put all of this together, right? And so that's what I tried to do.
Yeah, and she's done that. One Nation Under Blackmail is a fantastic book. Volume 2 delves into this deeper than any other book. I highly recommend it. But what I really liked about this interview and Whitney's focus here is how much Epstein and his past, his involvement in arms trafficking and money laundering. You only hear about the child molestation and child sex trafficking operation, which is an important and vile part of Epstein's past. Certainly so, especially because, in his later years, he was probably, or at least signs point to him, running a blackmail operation on behalf of Mossad or Israel to be an asset to gain leverage over prominent people in the United States. And that's why he was, floating around and associated with so many people of prominence, including President Trump and President Clinton. He had 17 visits to the Clinton White House, that this number wasn't even divulged until 2022. And before that, it was known that he knew Clinton. You know, Clinton flew on his jet. They were friendly, etc. But the extent to which that he visited the White House under the Clinton presidency wasn't well known. And the guy that facilitated that, the White House aide that facilitated his meetings with Epstein, was a guy named Mark Middleton. Well, what's the deal with Mark Middleton? He died mysteriously. You know, he killed himself is the narrative. They said that he committed suicide, but he was found hanging from an extension cord with also a shotgun blast to his chest. At first, the authorities said they couldn't find any weapon on the scene, and then they said they found one 30 yards away. It doesn't make sense. Jean-Luc Brunel, another one of Epstein's associates, also killed himself when French authorities tracked him down, an associate of Epstein's, likely a client in this sex trafficking operation, killed himself while awaiting charges in France. So this has ties beyond sex trafficking, also to Douglas Leese and Adnan Khashoggi. And beyond that, Epstein was involved in one of the biggest Ponzi schemes in U.S. history, the Towers financial Ponzi scheme, in which a guy named Stephen Hoffenberg collaborated with Epstein to fleece investors. And he went down for it. Hoffenberg spent 18 years in jail until his dying day. He said that Epstein was the real architect behind that arrangement and was deeply involved. But I really appreciated Whitney going through Epstein's past, showing some of the shady aspects of it and some of the most unexplainable, rises in his, path to power and prominence and wealth that just can't be explained in any other way than extracting blackmail, money, payments for blackmail, or a connection to an intelligence community, like in Mossad or like the CIA. We don't know. And both administrations that have been ruling the U.S. for the last 8 years haven't been exactly forthcoming about that, have they? And this is a bipartisan cover-up. Kash Patel and Pam Bondi aren't going to give you answers. They're trying to undermine Thomas Massie and Marjorie Taylor Greene and Ro Khanna for trying to bring you legitimate answers alongside the actual victims demanding for these files to be released. Never let them tell you through all their propaganda that the victims don't want to know. They do want to know. But I want to hear from you. Let me know down below. Is Whitney Webb right? What were some of the craziest aspects of Epstein's past, and was he working for Mossad? Let me know in the comments down below. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, also subscribe to Peter McCormick. Great podcast, great interview, Peter. Thank you so much. And please consider becoming a YouTube member. If you click the join button below, you can help support my channel, and in return, I'll give you access to all my videos before they go live to the general public. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. Catch you in the next one.